One thing is essential. To accelerate decisions, you need innovation that fits the mission. We innovate from AI to zero trust. We integrate using open APIs that you control. We automate with smart solutions so warfighters know and act faster. Your mission, accelerated. Tomorrow's challenges, anticipated. Win faster with Booz Allen.
Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today we're coming to you from the 2024 NDIA Future Forces Capabilities Conference and Exhibition, which is down in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And you can see some of the exhibit floor here behind us. The topics of this conference include emerging technology areas like armaments, robotics, munitions technologies, and integrated precision warfare. And to talk to me about what's going on in the conference are two of the experts in those fields. Matt Dooley, who's to my right. He's the chair of NDIA's Robotics Division and the Defense Strategic Initiatives lead at Forterra. And his colleague, Pat Acox, who is the head of government growth at Forterra. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So Matt and Pat, I didn't do anything on your bios and your background, so this is your chance. Tell us a little bit of how you got to your positions at Forterra and how you got to your position working at NDIA.
Well, I'll start since I'm the NDIA Ground Robotics Chair. You may be able to hear aircraft flying over from where we are in Virginia Beach. We're very close to Oceana Naval Air Station, so those F-18s are flying by. But I've been here in this area for a number of years. My last job was with the Army Capabilities Integration Center. I was chief of the robotics branch. So while I was still in uniform, a lot of the requirements that are currently active programs or emerging programs in the Army were things that I touched as a level 3 integrator. So I did that for about 3 years, and then I retired.
And you're a lab guy. You weren't wearing a uniform.
I was in uniform. I'm an armored cavalry officer. In those days, they were putting operators in positions to govern requirements so that we could take our operational experience and look at what the Army was asking to do as it built the Army for 2025. So that was my experience. When I got out, Forterra, who was called Robotic Research at the time, was one of the companies I began to talk to. And they've been doing autonomy for over 22 years. So I was aware of some of the things that they were doing to shape the field of ground autonomy long before I left the service.
Thanks, Matt. Pat Acox. So I was a Marine for a large part of my adult life, both on the enlisted side and then commissioned, where I supported conventional and special operations forces. 2019 timeframe, made the switch into capital markets. So left the active duty side behind, transitioned to reserves. And maybe about 4 years ago, a really good friend of mine came and pitched me on really getting back into the defense tech space. Said, hey, are you tired of making rich people richer? I said, yeah, like I feel the call back to mission. And eventually,
so you really had a finance part of your career.
I did. Yep. A lot of trading, which was great. And then found myself at Forterra. And I'll tell you, the most meaningful aspect to me is, dealt with a lot of different defense tech companies. A lot of it is focused on what I call like white collar jobs in the military. Like, hey, you're gonna operate an operations center. Maybe you're doing intel work, which is absolutely phenomenal. But the part that was missing was getting back to the folks who are really executing mission day in and day out, and what can we do on the hardware side to actually help support them.
So Matt, you're chair of NDIA's Robotics Division, and can you tell us what the division's focus is and what some of the activities are?
Yeah, you may notice that NDIA used to have what was called the Ground Robotics Division. We've removed ground out of the title of the division to get after what the Department of Defense has really accepted as the reality that multi-domain battle is multi-domain operations. You have to have multi-domain solutions. So the Robotics Division for NDIA is about pulling in those who build uncrewed aerial systems, uncrewed ground vehicle systems, maritime, both surface and subsurface robots, the control systems that integrate those, and most recently, the types of lethal payloads that we may integrate onto those systems. That conversation has to occur at a technical level. And in order to do that, you have to bring in the right industry leads who may or may not have worked with robots at all. And so the focus of the Robotics Division for the last few years has been pulling those industries together to have that conversation, so that when the government is ready to have the conversation about requirements and what those systems should look like after they're integrated, we're ready to show them what's in the realm of the possible.
So
We talk about autonomy. That's another layer of technical expertise you have to have, which is why it's important to have companies like Forterra involved in that discussion.
So you're dealing with all the domains, right? Like you said, which means you're probably engaging with government folks in all the services.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the military or organizations that typically engage with the Robotics Division?
Well, you're looking at three layers, and I'll pass off to Pat because I'm sure he has some perspectives as well. What's largely been a research, development, test, and evaluation layer has involved mostly DevCom. And for ground robots, that's the Ground Vehicle Systems Center in Detroit. But as machines move into procurement, the program management offices are also involved. So we talk a lot with PEO, Ground Combat Systems, and PEO, Combat Support and Combat Service Support, which are the two primary program executive offices that deal with programs for ground robotics.
Hey, thanks, Matt. So there's one area that I feel is always often the undersung hero of everything going on. That's the operators. And so that side of the house is also a very, very meaningful engagement, because we're not just talking about like material solution going out to them. It's how are we looking at workflows that they have? How are we compressing those timelines? How are they using the technology?
Right.
Like the worst thing that can happen is for a science and technology group to spend years and years developing great tech, and then for it to go out to procurement, and then for it to get handed over to the soldiers who are like, how am I going to use this new technology? This fundamentally changes organization, their doctrine, tactics. So there's an adoption curve on that side.
So you're going to see then engagement between the tech developers, like you said, and the acquisition community, the requirements community, but the actual operators as well. And then in terms of on the non-government side, then division activities do they include the big guys, little guys, universities, up and down everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. We do this more than once a year. We've reinstituted the robotics quarterlies. So once per quarter, not exactly on the quarter on the clock, but at least once every 3 or 4 months, we're trying to gather together the people that you talk about, industry, government, academia, those who are in this space to be able to share information. But as Pat mentioned, getting the user community and their feedback has been very helpful to us. So rather than just having someone talk about what the next budget decision is coming from the Pentagon, which is important, but getting the operator and their feedback to inform the capabilities that we are developing on the industry side, and then finding where that feedback needs to get to on the government side so we all speak with one voice, with one common understanding. There's a lot going on, and so you can imagine the difficulty of getting all this great information shared for a common operational picture for everyone who's involved in it.
Right. And getting industry involved in the setting of those requirements, in the shaping of the acquisition strategies, even in shaping the policy, because we're going to drift into issues of autonomous weapon systems, for example, right? So your division, I think, could play a leading role in helping industry engage in all of those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. DoD policy 3000.09 has recently changed. And so what we expect in terms of permissions for lethal engagement have loosened a little bit. And so it's important for industry to understand what the standards are, what the behavioral expectations are, and for us to be able to feed back to the government about what we can actually deliver, and is it trustworthy?
Right.
What's the level of assured control?
Right.
Forterra's perspective in developing autonomy for mobility is a different conversation than autonomy for lethality, but the integration of those capabilities is important to all of us.
Right. And even in that case, there are both technical issues for the government to understand, but policy issues, right? Integration of airspace, manned and unmanned airspace, those kinds of things. Just to drift a little bit, there's also this idea that you're competing in a global market for global customers. And so are there regulatory concerns along those lines that Forterra is sort of tracking at this point?
So there are, and we are tracking them. ITAR and EAR and whether it falls under state
Export
or commerce,
controls.
export controls are always kind of front of mind when dealing with a new country. AUKUS has been interesting. I think that's alleviated some of the restrictions and how to navigate into other foreign countries. Same is the same for like the Quad or NATO or anything like that. So with US and or UK and Australia, seems to be a little bit easier. Still kind of early days to see how that plays out. But yeah, it's absolutely a global market. And so on the Forterra side, both the defense and commercial business, those things still come up as well. We see, exports coming out of the APAC region, exports coming out of Europe, all kind of competing for similar plays on the commercial space. And then you get into like a little bit more bifurcated of a market, whereas are they doing on-road? Is it like a robo-taxi? Is it robo-trucking going from, hub and spoke cities out to different locations? What we've really focused in on is pretty highly constrained, highly technical, highly variable terrain. So think semi-private, private lots,
Right.
ports, right? And then has a direct corollary into defense spaces where the road you're driving on today is not going to be the road you're driving on tomorrow, or very well might not be. I think look at different conflicts and how those environments have changed. It lends itself more to that kind of autonomy. So that's been our approach.
Right. So for all the companies that are interested in participating in this conversation, then I would direct them over to your division, right?
Absolutely. The more the merrier.
Right.
And that's been some of our preferences in changing the name of the division to include more than just ground. We want to get as many people, as many industries, both large and small. It's not just enough to have the primes. We want to have some of the more innovative companies involved so that we can get the unified voice in front of the government to a degree that can be effective. We have to move and change at the speed of relevance. That the nature and the character of war are beginning to change a little bit. So if we're going to support the defense space,
Right.
Our technology has to keep pace with this evolving construct.
So one of your focusing events for the year is here, FFC. Tell us what the division has got planned here at FFC.
Well, what you see this year is largely a reflection of what we've done over the last 3 years, very deliberately pulling in those industries that do weapons payloads, whether it's a minigun or a chain gun or just the mount that these systems sit on, sensor providers, counter UAS providers, those who may not have looked at putting things on robots before are brought to this venue to talk to those who build the robots or those who may employ them. The idea is to get both those types of industries talking to each other so that when the government's ready to have a conversation about lethal autonomy on the battlefield, we can provide them in one industry perspective. We anticipate things changing over time now that you have more robotic systems entering the field in various roles, that there may be a broadening of what we do with the next future force that would be less lethal payload focused and more broadly autonomy focused. And so we're looking to see what we want to do next year based on what we get for content this year.
And you've got this nice exhibit floor down here as well, and it's reflecting what you said was your division makeup. I see small companies, I see larger companies, I see folks in uniform walking around. Can't tell who's a professor, but I'm sure there's a couple down here too. So what in particular down here on the floor, other than the great Emerging Technologies Institute booth, do you look forward to looking at?
For us, as autonomy providers, we're naturally very interested in those who are building the actual platforms, but having a conversation about where they're looking next and where there may be opportunities for us to work together. The idea of having an autonomy stack is interesting when you're just doing basic mobility. When you transition to maneuver, and Pat will talk more to this, about what Forterra does is a strong suit, being able to get off of improved routes and do things over broken terrain is something we want to have conversations with the platform providers about collaboration.
Yeah, so focus down on Forterra. What are you all working on that's relevant to this grander theme of deploying robotics more broadly across all the different sectors?
Yeah, I'll share a quote that I heard from somebody on the uniform side recently. It's essentially boils down to autonomous mobility is interesting, right? Sometimes it's compelling. Think about logistics. One of the things I think back to is 53% of the casualties from Global War on Terror were tied to logistics missions, right? It's a big number. Where it gets really interesting is basically getting something to the point in place at a time of need, specific time of need. So when I am here at Future Force Conference, it's great to see different payloads. It's great to see different robotics providers. It's interesting to hear their thoughts around autonomy and get feedback from that perspective. And really, it's great to set the stage for not just the ground side, but how do you get collaborative autonomy into the mix? So think UAS and UGVs working together. Again, it seems like an easier adoption curve going back to the operator concept. Many robots, one person, being able to organize and deploy systems that way.
How many autonomous systems are in programs of record and operational use today?
That's a great question.
And I guess I'll pick the hardest ones. Ground. Is that the hardest?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say so. When you look at those ground platforms that the U.S. Army is using, either in some sort of development testing or in limited fielding, if it's got autonomy on it, it's probably a Forterra system driving it. We're transitioning from what was largely been an RDT&E experimentation-led environment to an environment where commercial autonomy stacks are now being fielded. And so at the request, though in limited numbers, in some cases, you'll find our autonomy. There are other providers, and it's good to have some competition. It's good to have that dynamic. Some people are better at certain software modules than other companies. But in the end, as we move ahead, it will be guaranteed to be modular so that we can, I hate the term plug and play, but that's the best way to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
The government will control the interfaces. That makes a lot of sense. But we think we're relatively competitive in autonomous mobility. It's the question is, what else do you want to add? The Autonomous Tactical Vehicle System, ATVS, which are the PLS trucks, Forterra has been involved with that program by a number of different acronyms, whether it's Expedited Leader Follower, XLF, AMAS, ACO. It's essentially the same capability requirement, autonomous trucks for use on tactical MSRs and ASRs to get soldiers out of the cab and reduce the IED footprint. We've been involved in that for well over a decade as the government has worked through a government software stack. We've been involved with that evolution and then creating our own autonomy stack. So ultimately, we look forward to the competition when we start deciding who the autonomy providers are going to be.
So that we're not there yet, not deployed, but there's real programs of record.
Yeah, let's talk about a little about the 75th Rangers.
I'm gonna politely decline that one just because of the nature of the unit.
Yeah.
But what I will say is, on the Marine Corps side, there's Rogue Fires.
You get the classified podcast.
Yeah,
We can get into that.
sure.
Okay.
On the Marine Corps side, there's Rogue Fires. On the Army side, for autonomy requirements, there's ATVS. I think there's a couple of smaller emerging programs which are going out for competition. But by and large, this has been a really interesting. The question is almost a loaded question, right? How many autonomy programs of record are there? I think there's way more with an autonomy ready requirement than what there is for an autonomy requirement, which kind of gets to why it's great to be here today. Kind of talk about autonomy on platforms, maybe where the state of the tech is, some of the adoption curve.
So if I'm designing an Army ground system to be autonomy ready,
Mm-hmm.
and even commercial stack ready, is that a change in behavior from typical system design, hardware system designers? having to do things differently to be ready for you guys?
I think that the thing I appreciate most about the government is they're really, really good at standards and interface standards, and it helps out a ton. So IOP is great. Coming out of the labs, getting instituted on new platforms, it basically opens up the avenue for it to be a future capability, right? The other aspect I think about is drive-by-wire systems. So being able to move the actual vehicle through commands on the system itself. That's an interface. There's an exchange there. That part's great. I think the shift, if we look at the MOSA documents coming out, the modular open system architecture documents, there's a move to have those connections be more defined. And I think the idea of being able to evolve capability over a period of time, as opposed to having embedded software systems, is a change. So won't speak for the government, but from their policy changes, from the implementation guidance, it looks like that's the direction it's going.
So I think later on today in the conference, you both are going to be talking about drones and counter drone capabilities. Preview a little bit of where you think that conversation is going to go. What are you going to focus on?
Yeah, there are two. They're not ground autonomy conversations. One will be counter UAS, which is very topical. If you're paying attention at all to conflicts around the globe, I won't mention any by name, but certainly UAVs are an integral part of changing the character of both offensive and defensive war. So countering that is pretty important. So we're going to have a panel talk about that capability. We'll also talk about communications. Your enemy, your threat is going to seek to jam your systems. So how do you maintain assured communications with your robots? That's more than just a radio conversation.
Right.
And so we'll talk about that. And Pat's going to talk about the autonomy triad.
The autonomy triad.
The autonomy triad. So this is a Columbus moment. Like I'm pretty sure nothing new has been discovered.
Okay.
But the principle is this. I was doing some reading around nuclear deterrence. It's like, nuclear deterrence, we've been doing it since the start of the Cold War. It's been, really good at deterring nuclear war. Can't prove a counterfactual. But if you look at the number of warheads, the number of programs done over the years, what it hasn't really moved with is the number of conflicts globally, right? So you think nuclear weapons, probably pretty good at deterring large-scale wars. If you think about everything else, there's not really a deterrent effect below that.
Right.
And so when we think about, hey, how do we posture as a U.S. or as an allied force or coalition force globally? There's a real human capital constraint, right? Like you can't be everywhere at all times. You're going to be deploying in small pockets or working in small bilaterals. UAS are good. So my wife likes to tell me there's not a plane that hasn't landed yet, right? Everything eventually comes back down to the ground. So there's really a time of flight issue, but great for observation. When we look at the emerging USV market, so the unmanned surface vessels, some great companies out there doing great things. There's waterways. And then the last part, which seems to be kind of lagging behind the other two, tends to be the UGV profile, right? And when we think about conflicts and holding grounds and being able to have persistent presence, it doesn't happen without a ground force. And so what's being done there to close those gaps, to make small forces larger, more effective in their deployment profile, that's really the autonomy triad. They all have their parts to play, all do great things, but without one, it's kind of like a three-legged stool with two legs. Wouldn't want to sit on it, and end up on the floor. And that's the precept.
And there's some commonality there in the control systems and the software side.
100%.
Even if the hardware looks very different.
100%. And I think out of that is where you see, emerging areas out of the defense tech space. So, Matt, I'm not sure. How long have you been talking about common controller for all the platforms?
Anywhere between 12 to 14 years, depending on who you ask.
Yeah. So when we think about common controller, we think about networks. Like those are the underpinnings of how you have a robotic force. It's incredibly important. The idea of, hey, if I have to walk next to this thing for 22 miles, then why don't I just get a truck and drive it out there? Like
right.
I'm exposed to no less risk. So that network, that common operational picture, hugely important in how we fight. But on the ground side, right, being able to push forces beyond, how are you trusting autonomy? That gets back to the operator perspective of what's the level at which they are comfortable with it, because that's really the adoption curve.
So there is a large operational presence here, folks in uniform walking around, international partners, and there's use of unmanned systems globally right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, there's a big cat and mouse game going on, drone versus counter drone, and we're seeing what the other guy does and react. Curious, how much of that is a game of their software versus our software and their sensors versus our sensors, as opposed to I have to rebuild my hardware system?
That's a loaded question again. I have Pat has some of his own opinions. I have mine. I don't think we're into the sophistication argument of AI software versus AI software yet. Do I think we'll get there? Possibly. It's a kind of a science fiction question. But hardware and jamming countermeasures, electronic jamming countermeasures, that's certainly visible now. You can talk about it open source. You can see it. The life cycle of a UAV until there's a countermeasure adopted can be measured in hours, if not just a couple of weeks. So there's no such thing as a final confirmed capability solution that you just slap the table and walk away. This idea of having to innovate in real time, both your hardware and your systems, is something that's a reality.
Right. With user feedback.
With user feedback or threat feedback. Was it effective? How many of those systems that you had to send out to actually get an effective strike? And is there ever a day where everything just suddenly works? No, it doesn't. Are there tactics that are not technical? Do you shift and change things? The Army is shifting back to the fundamentals. Camouflage is important. Fieldcraft, basic soldier fieldcraft, soldier skills are important. So some of the things you see are not just technical adjustments or tactical adjustments. That's a reality. So yeah, Pat, you may have some other ideas.
Now, I'll echo the comment. I mean, it's not yet the AI on AI, Skynet versus Skynet approach going on. The network defeat is, I mean, that's a real threat. It's a real threat to how people operate without autonomous systems. The link is very much a threat to how people operate with the systems. I think that those are really good trade spaces, right? And I'll give a really practical example. Uncrewed systems are always going to have some level of data coming back, right? Back and forth. That's kind of the inherent in the trade space. As you trust autonomy more, you task off more missions. There's less of a need for exchange going back and forth. But how that message is transported varies pretty significantly, right? So it's back to the old principles of electronic warfare. Hey, if people are operating on HF, like do you move to VHF? Do you have free copying? How much you're using civilian networks like cellular telemetry to push messages? How much you're using things like commercial SATCOM versus military SATCOM? Those are all slight changes to overall approach. I think the platforms kind of stay the same and evolve the capability on top. And it's pretty much in line with the modular mission payload you hear a lot about.
And with that, we're going to have to draw the conversation to a close. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Matt, for joining me today. I want to tell you all to please visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, educational offerings, and our Tech 101 series. I want to highlight a upcoming symposium that we're doing with the MITRE Corporation on the use of artificial intelligence to help the acquisition workforce. So not quite as cool as what they do, more like market research, cost analysis, those kinds of things. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel and stay up to date with all of our latest content and episodes. If you have ideas for future podcasts and topics you want us to hit, please email them to us at eti@ndia.org. Special thanks to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing the podcast. Thanks so much, Matt and Pat, for joining us today.
Thanks
for having us.
And thank you all for watching Emerging Tech Horizons.